because other countries were observing how America's government both treated through its legal system, its laws, and through the omission and absence of engagement when black people were being mistreated. They were observing and rendering opinions about that behavior. So it placed the United States on the map, but not in a good way. The civil rights movement was important, and you have to know too that the people who worked during the civil rights, you typically only hear a couple of names, Abernathy, King. We only hear a couple of names popularized from that movement. But there was an army of people who often did not see eye to eye about how we should engage our fight, our struggle for equality, equity, fair treatment under the law, and that place in society where we were treated with the same sense of dignity and respect as white people. There were lots of different views. And what we call that, what we say about that is, we use the term monolithic. It was not monolithic. We were not carved from the same stone. An example of that is the Students Nonviolent Coordination Committee. Have you ever heard of SNCC? Yeah, this is some very important stuff. SNCC were made up of young people who decided to get in this fight for civil rights. They didn't sit on the sidelines and they didn't wait on adults. They were, in many cases, considered more courageous than adults. They were more apt to speak their mind, and they wanted to put it on the line. And so the young people often were in conflict with the older adults, particularly Martin Luther King. And many of them were very, very graphic in their description of King. They would say he was, they would say things like he was a sellout, that he wasn't aggressive enough, those sorts of things. And while I'm there, because Dr. King respected their work and their effort, he always kept the disagreement behind closed doors, always wanting to maintain what we call a united front. The united front is important when people are working to the same ends, even though they may disagree. So the movement happened on two fronts, and this is what I think about it most. Hello, Dr. Hall.
Hey.
Come on, I'll introduce you. Let me finish this response. I want to introduce you. The movement happened on two fronts. There was the civic engagement of grassroots organizations led by people who were non-political, who had no power, no influence. But then you had that front that was being waged from the legal standpoint. So, for instance, if you've heard of Brown versus Education, okay, if you notice, that wasn't King versus Education, right? It was Brown versus Education. So if King did the work on the ground, he inspired people, he led marches, he was an iconic figure in the movement, but King didn't write any laws. For that, we needed people like Thurgood Marshall working to create laws and to advocate on the legal front for the rights of African Americans in our country. Dr. Hall, these are young people.
It's not going to be all that, but that what was so interesting about the civil rights movement is that to a large extent it was a grassroots movement. So it started with everyday people and everyday struggle. And it started with people in their homes. So it didn't start at an institution, but it started in communities, in people's homes. And that a lot of the economic resources that fueled the civil rights movement came from people sacrificing and giving part of their money um, towards seeing a kind of difference. The other thing is that it was a multiracial movement. So you had the influence of Jewish synagogues who participated within the movement as well. That's why if you see with King, he's always got Joshua Heschel, the rabbi, along with him. So it was a multiracial movement as well. And the other part is that even what preceded King is King joined a movement that was already going on. But it was already going, the movement was already there before King ascends to be a part of the leadership in that movement. But there are people who preceded him. Well, and that before it was an above ground movement, it was already an underground grassroots movement. That's the other part. And you can never, since he's a theologian, is that what I loved about it is you can never really detach the social movement from the spiritual work and the work that was done in the black church. Right? You've got to see those as interconnected between the kind of theology that was being taught in the black church and how that was what was a central part of how they thought about the movement. So even though Gandhi had an influence on King, it was not Gandhi, but it was the black church, and how the black church is what shaped him and shaped his identity. You know, and at the center of all of the civil rights movements within Black America, it's been that church and it's been that deep spirituality that has fueled that movement.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. Thank you.
that's why you're talking to somebody who knows the church and the church history very well. Right.
Thank
I'll see y'all
you.
later.
Thank you. Thank you.
I won't be at most of tomorrow since we doing that. We got to be here all day tomorrow.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I thought you didn't come in until 4 today.
Well, I'm meeting with my students.
Oh, okay.
My
Okay.
students.
I'll see you later then.
Yes.
Okay. RJ.
All right, Doc.
Okay.
Brother Mize,
Yes, sir.
did you want to add anything to the discussion on the civil rights movement? I think it'd be rich to hear your voice.
I'm sorry, sir. I did not
I
understand.
said, would you like to add anything to this discussion on the civil rights movement? I think it'd be rich to have your voice added to the interview.
My voice?
Yes, sir.
No, I have nothing to add. Okay. I overheard some of your remarks and they were quite eloquent.
We're
Okay.
not done. I'm sure they have more questions. If you hear something that sparks you,
Okay, I
come over,
shall.
jump
I
in.
shall do so.
Jump
Okay.
in. Mhm.
Sure thing. Thank you for the invite.
Yes, sir. Doctor, are we
You ready for a new question?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering if you thought that the board versus education was significant today.
Is it significant today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is a controversial topic among various camps. I used the word earlier, monolithic. We're not a monolithic group. So among African Americans, African American thinkers, there's a great deal of controversy around whether that was a good decision for African Americans. Because the hope was that black children would receive the same quality of education as white children, have access to the same resources as white children, and that they would then be competitive or as competitive with white children because they would benefit from those same resources. And we're talking not only material resources, but also human resources, teachers and instructors and those sorts of things. Donald Northcross, who is a social advocate, social activist, and committed worker to advance the quality of life among African Americans in our country, tells of a story when he was a young man being bused into the white schools after the decision was made. It was a few years later, because if you recall, the judgment was handed down, but actually implementing that, states dragged their feet in the implementation of it. He lived in Ashdown, Arkansas. It was in the late 50s. And he recalled how excited the black children were because the white schools had swimming pools and they had new books, and they just thought that they were going to be accepted and loved and embraced. And all of the black children wanted to learn how to swim, you know, how children think. And to his dismay, on his first day of school, he discovered that the swimming pool had been cemented and made a parking lot because white families did not want their children swimming with the black children. The teachers frequently used the N-word to refer to them, and everyone in his class, even though he was at the top of his class as a student, he tells a story how when he was ready to go to school, he didn't wait on his parents to enroll him. He actually told them he wanted to enroll in school. They said, "We'll take you." He says, "No, I'll take myself." And he walked himself to school and enrolled in school, and he was a straight A student at the top of his class. Well, when they bust into the other school system and integration, the very first thing that shocked him was that they held everyone in his class back a grade because of the assumption that the educational system for black people was less than that being provided white children. And so he recalled how devastated he was and how he didn't graduate his class and that he was held back and how this just ripped him apart. So one of the features of those among African American scholars, one of the features of their thought and ideas is this question, or maybe more of a statement, that African Americans are the only people in history that fought to permit and authorize their oppressors to train their children. No other group in history has ever done that. So you degrade me, you have no love for me, you have no value for me, and yet I want you to educate my children. They would have much preferred that we had organized ourselves as communities and loved our children and nurtured our children and provided our children with the best education that they could. So even today I'm torn by that reality. And even if you look at the demographics among teachers in inner city schools today, there's a high percentage of white Americans, females, European American females who teach black children. And the challenge with this is that, not that they're simply white, but most of them live in suburbs, they don't shop, live, work among, engage, socialize with black people. They simply are employed. And that's not to say that they have evil intent. That's not to say that they are there to harm black children, no. And I know plenty of white teachers who are excellent teachers and they connect with black children. But the dearth of people who look like the child, who has a deep and intimate care and investment in their child's educational welfare, may be questionable when you have that type of ratio among teachers and students. So to answer your question, for me, the jury is still out on whether or not that was beneficial. If you look across the United States and the condition of education, particularly for poor and black children, when compared to other groups, it's dismal. The educational gap still exists. And not only that, if you've heard language like the school to prison pipeline, and the demographics of the penitentiary still reflect that we are failing children when it comes to public education.
Okay. My question is, how do you think the civil rights movement changed or made our world different from back then?
So I think the civil rights movement raised consciousness, and as Dr. Hall talked about, it united people. It gave people opportunities to step up and advocate for each other. It gave hope, a sense of hope that America could be a better place, and that you had whites who, you heard Dr. Hall talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel, who led the civil rights movement and was an iconic figure in the Jewish community, leading the effort to
All righty.
provide
Good to
civil
see you, Heidi.
rights and equality.
You're
for
welcome.
human beings. And to understand that civil rights, particularly from people's the standpoint of people like Martin Luther King, wasn't just for black people. It was equal rights for every human being, and that he saw the sacredness and dignity of all human beings. And so the movement gave attention to that. Whether it was completely and utterly successful, I think again the jury is out on that, because the progress that we've made towards full equality, acceptance, and full access to wealth and to political and social capital still has yet to be determined. I'm not so sure that we've done so well since the civil rights movement. That's not to say we haven't made gains. And to understand too that any gains that we've made have not been because of the commitment of the collective to the idea. It's always been due to the collective of individuals, as Dr. Hall said, on that grassroots level, who fight every day and who leverage the laws of our country. 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, understanding these are acts and not laws.
No, thank you.
And so
Yes.
they leverage those legal decisions to advance our interest, which is for many to be fully integrated into society. And I'm not so sure how that's working for us. I'm really not so sure.
I can go if you're not ready. Okay, my next question is, were the Black Panthers racist, and what good did they bring to the community?
Absolutely not. I don't see the Black Panthers as being racist at all. I often say to students and this has just been my experience as a person, is that when it comes to black men in particular, you don't have to be offensive to offend. You simply have to protect your own self-interest.
Okay.
I don't have to offend you, step on your toe. I simply just have to tell you no.
Right.
Because there's something in the psyche of privileged people that says that black people should be conformist, they should be silent, they should accept what they get. And so when you advocate for yourself, and particularly on micro levels, like if you worked in a company or an organization, the critique of black men typically is he is arrogant, or there's a different word that they use for black women when they assert themselves. But when whites are critiqued, even by the same people, you will hear a very different language. And I think part of that is because of their relationship, the collective relationship that they have with people of the same kind. That person doesn't present as a threat because maybe they know them. And so, well, one person may be assertive, aggressive, the kind of person we want on the team. This person is angry, resistant, arrogant. Those kind of characteristics are superimposed upon them. So what Carmichael and what the Panthers were attempting to do were simply to organize the black community to address its most pressing needs. hungry school children, brutality from the police. They weren't organizing to undermine the government, not per se. If undermining the government meant advocating for your own well-being, then I guess one could interpret it as such. But their objective was simply to educate and empower black people to straighten their backs. Again, we were not a monolithic group. Their approach was different, even from that of Malcolm X in some respects, because it did not have that religious component. It was certainly different from King's, because Martin Luther King would not advocate for picking up arms, and there's real good reason for that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Pardon?
How did you feel about the stand your ground law by the Alex? I think that's what
So, stand your ground law would, for in my mind, fall into that category of laws. And to be sure, just looking at policing, because I have a background in
I was
policing.
getting into it.
Yeah. So, the organization of policing in America was never founded upon the protection of human dignity and the rights of all people. It was always founded, it was created and implemented to protect property and the interests of oligarchs, powerful people, decision makers. So in the Northeast, for instance, you had the police were there to protect against unions, the organization of unions. In the South, along the border, was to protect from illegal immigrants and to reunite escaped enslaved people with their masters. So the system was never designed to protect the interest of all people per se. It was really to protect property. And I know a number of scholars would disagree with my perspective on this, and that's okay. So the stand your ground law, and this is something that you have to, that we ask our students to do, is look at these things with a critical eye, asking first the question, who has what to gain by this law, belief, system being in place? And then the next question is, who has what to lose if this law, belief, system, policy is in place? And we know statistically that just in Florida alone, and maybe even across the country, but we know in Florida alone, that it's had adverse and egregious effect on community psychology, the psychological well-being of the black community there. So that's a negative, egregious, adverse impact. And we also know that it has sent more black people to jail than whites. And we know that it's allowed more whites to go free than blacks. And there are numerous illustrations of this. Just recently was the young man who was shot in front of his son, his little boy, stood courageously by his side, didn't leave his father's side, followed him into the store, watched him kneel down and take his last conscious breaths. This young boy sat here and witnessed this. This was a death sentence for pushing down another man. The man that shot him went home. The man initiated the aggressive act. The man threatened the family of that man, his child, his children, his spouse, his loved ones. He rightfully would have been the one to stand his ground and defend his family. But the law wasn't applied to his act. It was applied to the man who pulled the gun, the aggressor, and who shot him. Now, that man went home and slept in his bed and placed phone calls to his family, while the other family had this severe loss. Years earlier, prior, in the same state, you had a black female who received threats from her husband that he was going to kill her. She filed protective orders. He threatened to come to the house and kill her. He came to the house, forced entry, and she took a gun and shot into the ceiling of the house. Now, this would certainly apply the stand your ground rule from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But the police arrested her, and she was convicted for up to 30 years in prison and had to undergo a long, sustained legal battle, of which I'm not sure is really complete at this point. I don't know, I haven't followed the story. But that law has not been applied equally. And so again, you have to know, even though laws are in place, human beings decide whether to enforce those laws based on their value systems, their vantage point, their perspective, their political interest, right? What is at stake for them? And so that's why it's important that the civil rights movement never end. And for me, the civil rights movement is the deliberate activity of human beings of all races, colors, creeds, backgrounds, who agree on one thing, and that is the precious life of all human beings.
Hey, good morning, JL.
The sacredness.
Hey, good morning, Dr. Hathaway.
How are you, sir?
I'm great. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, sir.
The sacredness and dignity, the preservation of the sacredness, the innate and intrinsic sacredness and dignity of all human beings, no matter their status, their economic capital, their political capital, their educational capital. And so any human being who is under assault because of characteristics they cannot control, the color of their skin, you know, maybe even some physical characteristics that they can control, maybe their weight, maybe their gender, maybe their sexual orientation, maybe their political beliefs. When they come under assault, all of us need to stand up. All of us need to stand up and contest it. It just so happens that black people, poor people, Hispanic people, and particularly black men, are seriously under assault and are not getting the kind of reprieve and benefit from laws in our country that others are.
Okay, I got a question getting into the law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're not in that no more?
I'm retired.
Okay.
Correct.
So I think that police officers or whatever, anybody in the law enforcement field are just normal people just like any of us. So who finds what they do is wrong? Or like, who's protecting them?
Who protects police?
Mm-hmm.
Ask the question again, because I want to understand the question before I attempt to answer it.
Like, it was two questions.
Okay.
Actually.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The first one was who finds what they not doing right. If like, my question is like they are looking out for what we're doing. Who's looking out for what they're doing?
I see. So one of the great challenges across the country, and from people who are part of grassroots organizations, oftentimes they understand law, criminal law, oftentimes they don't. For some, criminal law is this globule of esoteric information that only people who do the work are supposed to understand, and then the rest of society have to glean what it might be from TV shows, movies, and etc. Right? Oftentimes, art imitates real life. Oftentimes, it does. One of the challenges is that police are policing themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of problems with this, because there are the very people who are responsible for punishing them when they're wrong live next door to them. They are at their child's friends' bar mitzvah, fellow officers' bar mitzvahs. They are there when their children are born. They're good friends, and they're part of this institution called the Fraternal Order of Police, where they have this deep bond with each other. And you're asking them to render judgments that will have negative impact on the existence of their friends forever. And I think many argue rightfully that that should not be the case, that there should always be this autonomous, independent agency that renders judgment on police officers' misbehavior. Now, you won't hear police officers agree with that. Oh no, we don't want, because they don't understand that, so they can't judge us. But we understand murder, we understand violence, we understand disrespect, we understand theft, we understand all of those things, abuse of children, we understand all of that. And certainly police have engaged in all of those and far more horrible criminal activities. In my career, I've seen a lot of effort go into protecting officers who are criminal. And I've seen little effort to protect officers that needed protection, maybe because of their status, their race, other characteristics. They didn't quite fit in with the larger organization. And then that's where grassroots organizations and the individual citizen have to come into play. As Northcross used to say, if you put an image of your head of the tail wagging the dog, you might laugh, because tails don't wag dogs. Dogs wag tails. And the government, citizens elect their representatives in government. And the government should be answerable to the citizen. If the citizen has an issue, the government should respond to it, not say, take what we give you. That's the tail wagging the dog. Citizens organize and say, we want better protection, we want a better relationship with law enforcement, we want to feel that we are as valued as wealthy people who get services from police officers. We want to be treated like we have the capital of being a citizen in Indianapolis, like other citizens. We want resources. And so the citizens should be organizing to say, here's what we want. And they should be weighing in on the behavior of rogue, unprofessional officers. And so, and we make that distinction. I don't use the blanket with whites or with blacks. Now, when we talk about, with police officers, when we talk about whites in general, we cannot avoid what we call privilege that whites tend to benefit from, even if they are not aware of it. And